The snap of her third rib was a sound she would never forget. It did not echo in the cavernous, frost-rimmed expanse of the Silvertooth Pack's subterranean pantry. Instead, the sickening crack reverberated entirely within the hollow cage of her own chest, a private, violent explosion of bone splintering under the crushing weight of a reinforced leather boot. Cora Vance did not scream. She kept her head bowed and her spine straight, even as her body was violently thrown against the unforgiving, jagged surface of the damp cellar wall. The impact knocked whatever fragile reserve of oxygen remained in her lungs out into the freezing air, leaving her gasping, her vision swimming in a chaotic sea of grey and black spots. The taste of copper immediately flooded her mouth, thick and metallic, pooling beneath her tongue. Because begging wouldn't have changed the outcome. It never did. Standing over her, entirely unfazed by the brutality he had just unleashed, was Keith, her stepbrother, the acting alpha of the Silvertooth Pack, a man whose ambition was matched only by his absolute, terrifying cruelty. He adjusted the pristine silver cuffs of his tailored winter coat, his shadow stretching across the icy stone floor like a localized eclipse, completely swallowing Cora in darkness. "You are a complication, Cora," Keith said, his voice a low, vibrating hum that carried the oppressive weight of a predator cornering its prey. There was no heat in his tone, only the cold, calculated arithmetic of a man measuring livestock, a wolfless, useless complication left behind by a mother who didn't have the decency to take you with her to the grave. But even useless things have their price. Cora pressed the side of her face against the freezing stone floor. The biting cold of the granite was a stark, almost welcome contrast to the white-hot agony radiating from her sternum. Every time she attempted to draw a breath, a jagged line of pure fire arched through her side, a brutal reminder that the bone was not just bruised, but dangerously fractured. If it shifted the wrong way, it would puncture a lung. She knew this. She had read the medical texts in the Pack's library during the brief, stolen hours of the night when the rest of the manor slept. "A ruthless bordering alpha has agreed to a merger of our territories," the man above her continued, his boots clicking slowly against the stone as he paced in a tight half-circle around her fallen form. "He requires a bride to finalize the treaty, a submissive, quiet Omega. He specifically requested one whose spirit has already been managed. You will mate with him at the ceremony on the eve of the winter solstice. That is 3 days from now." Cora closed her eyes. This bordering alpha was notorious. He had buried 3 mates in the span of a decade, and the rumors of what went on behind the iron gates of his remote estate were enough to make even seasoned warriors turn their heads in disgust. To be handed over to him was not a political alliance. It was a death sentence draped in white silk. "Look at me when I speak to your future, little sister," Keith sneered, suddenly reaching down, his heavy gloved hand tangled ruthlessly into the silver-white waves of her hair, yanking her head back. A sharp gasp escaped her lips as the violent motion pulled at the torn muscles around her fractured rib. The agony was blinding. It stole her sight for a fraction of a second, replacing the dim cellar light with a blinding flash of white. But when her vision cleared, she forced her eyes open. She stared up into his face. Her gaze was completely devoid of tears. There was only a storm-glass grey emptiness, a silent, impenetrable fortress of pride that she had spent years building brick by brick. She did not whimper. She did not plead for mercy. Keith's jaw tightened. The scent of his irritation flared in the confined space, a suffocating, bitter aroma of rotting pine and ozone. He hated her silence. He hated that, no matter how much physical pain he inflicted, he could never break the quiet dignity that radiated from her bones. It was an insult to his dominance, a silent rebellion he could not crush with his fists. With a low grunt of disgust, he released her hair, letting her drop back onto the unforgiving stone. "You will stay in this cellar until the ceremony," the stepbrother declared, wiping his leather glove against his coat as if she had somehow soiled it. "No food, no blankets. Perhaps the freezing dark will teach you the gratitude you so clearly lack. When his carriage arrives, you will walk out of here. You will smile, and you will accept his claiming bite. If you attempt to run, I will not just break your ribs. I will snap your spine and hand you to him paralyzed." He turned on his heel, his heavy boots echoing off the low, arched ceiling of the subterranean room. The heavy iron-wrought door of the pantry groaned in protest as he hauled it open. Enjoy the cold, Cora. The door slammed shut with a finality that sounded like the end of the world. The massive iron deadbolt slid into place with a heavy metallic clank. Then there was only silence. The darkness that claimed the room was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. The temperature in the cellar, already hovering near freezing, seemed to plummet the moment the door was sealed. Cora lay perfectly still on the ground for what felt like hours, listening to the erratic, shallow rhythm of her own heartbeat. Thump! 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 It was a frail, fragile sound against the overwhelming silence of her frozen tomb. Slowly, agonizingly, the numbness of the initial shock began to wear off, replaced by the crushing reality of her injuries. The cold was seeping her thin, torn linen dress, sinking its icy teeth into her flesh, attempting to freeze the blood in her veins. She needed to move. If she stayed on the floor, hypothermia would take her long before the Allied Alpha ever got the chance. Inhale, hold, exhale. She coached herself through the pain. Rolling onto her uninjured side required a monumental effort of will. Her hands, trembling violently from the cold and the shock, pressed against the stone. Pushing herself up into a sitting position felt like attempting to lift a mountain. A quiet, strangled sob finally broke through her lips as the fractured edges of her third rib ground together, sending a shockwave of nausea violently through her stomach. She wrapped her arms tightly around her midsection, applying direct pressure to the broken bone to keep it stabilized. The stone wall behind her offered a meager support as she dragged her back up along its rough surface, finally coming to a kneeling position. She had 3 days. 3 days before Keith handed her over to a monster. 3 days before her life ended in a pool of blood in a stranger's bed. She didn't know Gideon Sterling was currently mobilizing his armies. She didn't know a territorial war was brewing just beyond the mountain ranges, and she definitely didn't know that the very magic pulsing dormant in her blood was the key to an ancient prophecy. All she knew was the searing pain in her chest, the freezing air of the cellar, and the desperate, primal instinct to survive. Her mind, usually sharp and analytical, raced through her non-existent options. She had no allies in the Silvertooth Pack. The servants were too terrified of the acting Alpha to intervene, and the Pack warriors were blindly loyal to his cruelty. There was no one within these walls who would risk their life for a wolfless Omega, but beyond these walls, a memory flickered in the darkness of her mind. A name, spoken in hushed, reverent whispers by her late mother, Alistair, an exiled warrior, a childhood friend of her mother's who had been banished to the southern borders years ago. He was a rogue now, operating a small sanctuary for castaways and runaways near the southern borders. Her mother had once told her, "If the wolves of Silvertooth ever bare their fangs at you, Cora, seek Alistair. He owes me a life debt, he will answer." It was a desperate, impossible gamble. The southern borders were weeks away by foot, and she was locked in a subterranean vault with broken bones. But a gamble was better than a guarantee of death. She needed to send a message. Opening her eyes to the pitch-black room, Cora let her other senses take over. She knew this cellar intimately. For years it had been her designated punishment room, a place of isolation where she was sent whenever her mere existence offended her stepbrother. She knew exactly where the old, defunct fireplace sat in the far corner. She knew where the discarded wooden crates were stacked. Dragging herself across the floor, inch by agonizing inch, she navigated by touch. The cold stone scraped against her bare knees, tearing the skin, but she couldn't afford to care. Her breaths came in short, ragged gasps, white plumes of condensation, barely visible in the suffocating dark. Her fingers finally brushed against the rough, splintered wood of a broken crate. Reaching inside, she fumbled among the debris, her hands desperately searching for a specific texture. There, her fingertips snagged on a thick, stiff material. It was a torn scrap of heavy vellum, an old ledger page that had been discarded months ago to serve as kindling. It was no larger than the span of her hand, but it was enough, the parchment of desperation. Now, she needed ink. She dragged herself toward the old fireplace. The iron grate was rusted and coated in decades of ancient, hardened soot. She reached her hand in, her fingers coming away, coated in black, chalky ash, but soot alone wouldn't bind to the vellum. It would blow away the moment it hit the wind. It needed a liquid base. Cora hesitated, her hand hovering over her own side. The left side of her linen dress was completely soaked, sticky and warm with her own blood, where the jagged impact of the boot had split the skin over her ribs. It was a morbid, terrifying solution, but the only one she had. Her hands swept the floor near the hearth until they closed around a long, heavily rusted iron nail that had fallen from the wooden mantel years ago. The metal was freezing to the touch, its point jagged and uneven. It would serve as her quill. Cora shifted her weight, ignoring the fresh wave of dizziness that washed over her. She placed the scrap of vellum flat on a relatively smooth floor stone. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she pressed her fingers to the wound on her ribs. The pain was astronomical, a blinding flare that made her bite her own tongue to keep from crying out. But when she pulled her fingers away, they were slick with thick, warm crimson. She quickly rubbed the wet blood against the pile of soot she had scraped from the grate, mixing them together on the floor. The result was a dark, muddy paste, a grim, metallic-smelling ink born of her own suffering. Gripping the rusted nail with trembling fingers, she dipped the tip into the morbid mixture. She had to be concise. There was no room for lengthy explanations, no space to detail the horrors of her existence. She just needed him to know she was alive, and she was out of time. Her hand shook violently, but she forced her wrist to lock, pressing the jagged metal tip to the vellum, Alistair. The first word scratched against the stiff paper, the mixture of soot and blood drying almost instantly in the freezing air, leaving a dark, rust-colored stain. Keith fractured ribs, 3 days until forced mating. Every letter was a physical battle. The exertion of holding herself upright, of focusing her eyes in the near-pitch darkness, was draining the last dregs of her adrenaline. Her head drooped, her chin hitting her chest, but she forced herself back up, dipping the nail again. Sanctuary requested. Mother's debt, save me, Cora. She dropped the nail. It clattered loudly against the stone, the sound echoing mockingly in the empty cellar. Cora stared down at the torn scrap of vellum. The words were uneven, frantic, smeared with bloody fingerprints on the edges, but they were legible. It was a plea carved from her very life force, but writing the letter was only half the battle. Delivering it was a near impossibility. She turned her head slowly, looking up toward the very top of the cellar wall. High above, near the ceiling, was a small, narrow ventilation grate that opened out to the ground level of the manor's exterior. It was heavily barred with iron, too small for a human to pass through, but just wide enough to let the bitter winter wind howl into the room. Through the bars, she could see the swirling chaos of the storm outside. The winter solstice blizzard had arrived early. Snow was whipping past the grate horizontally, a violent, blinding whiteout that roared with the primal fury of the mountains. And huddled on the narrow stone ledge just inside the grate, seeking refuge from the lethal storm, was a small bundle of white feathers, the frostwing hawk. Cora had found the bird 3 weeks ago, lying half dead in the snow near the kitchens with a broken left wing. Frostwings were majestic, rare creatures native to the deep northern peaks, entirely out of place in the southern territories of Silvertooth. The pack warriors had wanted to kill it for sport, but Cora had quietly smuggled the injured bird into this very cellar. Every night, risking severe beatings, she had sneaked down here with scraps of raw meat and strips of torn cloth, meticulously binding the bird's wing, whispering to it in the dark. She had seen herself in the broken creature, a wild thing, trapped, injured, waiting for the cold to finish the job. But the hawk had fought back. It had healed. For the past 2 days, it had been testing its wings, waiting for the right current to carry it home. "Here," Cora rasped, her voice a broken thread of sound. "Here, little one." The white hawk shifted on the high ledge. It turned its head, its sharp, intelligent amber eyes piercing the gloom of the cellar. It let out a soft, trilling chirp of recognition. It did not fear her. She was the bringer of food, the gentle hands in the dark. Getting to the window required scaling a haphazard stack of old, rotting storage crates piled against the wall. For a healthy person, it would be a simple climb. For a woman with a severely fractured third rib, it was tantamount to climbing a glacier without ropes. Cora tucked the blood-stained vellum into the waistband of her dress, right against her skin to keep it dry. She crawled to the base of the crates. If I fall, the bone snaps completely. The thought was clinical, detached. If I don't climb, I die anyway. She reached up, her raw fingers gripping the edge of the lowest wooden box. She pulled. The pain that exploded in her chest was so absolute it defied description. It wasn't just a physical sensation. It was a sensory wipeout, a wave of agony so intense it tasted like burning ash and sounded like a high-pitched ringing in her ears. Her knees buckled, threatening to drop her back to the floor. But she locked her joints. She dragged her right foot up, planting it on a protruding wooden slat, and pushed upward. Tears finally leaked from the corners of her eyes, freezing almost instantly against her cold cheeks. But she didn't stop. She climbed. Each inch of vertical progress was purchased with a fresh wave of nausea and a terrifying grinding sensation in her ribcage. She was sweating despite the freezing temperature, her body operating entirely on the primal fumes of survival. When her face finally crested the level of the high window ledge, she collapsed against the stone, her arms hanging weakly over the rim. She was panting, her breath fogging the freezing air, her forehead resting against the iron bars of the grate. The frostwing hawk hopped closer, tilting its head, its sharp beak gently nudging her trembling knuckles. "I need a favor," Cora whispered, her voice barely audible over the roaring wind outside. "I fixed your wing. Now you have to be my wings." She reached into her waistband with shaking fingers and withdrew the torn parchment. Next she grasped the hem of her ruined dress, locating a loose, heavy linen thread, and pulled until a long strand snapped free. The bird remained perfectly still as Cora's trembling, bloody hands reached out. She carefully wrapped the scrap of vellum around the hawk's left leg, the same leg she had splinted weeks ago, and bound it tightly with the linen thread. She tied the knot 3 times, her numb fingers fumbling, ensuring it would not come loose in the violent winds. The blood and soot on the paper had dried into a permanent, dark proof of her desperation. "Go south," Cora whispered, her face inches from the bird's pristine white feathers. She could feel the rapid, vital thumping of the hawk's heart, a stark contrast to her own failing strength. "Reach the southern borders. Seek Alistair, please." She pushed her hands through the iron bars, gently ushering the bird toward the swirling white abyss outside. The frostwing hawk stepped out onto the exterior sill. The sheer force of the blizzard immediately battered its small body, ruffling its feathers violently. For a terrifying second, Cora thought the bird would refuse to fly, that the storm was too strong, too lethal, even for a creature of the winter. But then, with a sharp, defiant shriek that cut through the howling wind, the hawk launched itself from the stone. It dropped initially, pushed down by a heavy downdraft, and Cora's heart stopped. But a moment later, the powerful white wings snapped open, catching a massive, violent updraft. The bird shot upward into the sky, a tiny speck of white against a canvas of grey and black storm clouds. Cora watched it through the iron bars, her hands gripping the cold metal, a fragile, desperate hope blooming in her shattered chest. "Go south," she prayed to whatever moon goddess was listening. Go south. But Cora didn't understand the ancient meteorology of the realm, nor did she comprehend the magical pressure systems generated by the distant territories. She couldn't feel the massive, unnatural pull of the arcane storm front moving across the continent. The moment the frostwing hawk breached the tree line, it fought valiantly to turn its body toward the southern borders, but the wind was absolute. A massive, howling gale caught the bird in its invisible grip, entirely overriding the creature's navigational instincts. The storm did not blow south, it blew north. It blew with terrifying, unrelenting speed, carrying the tiny bird and its blood-soaked cargo away from the safety of the southern borders, driving it straight toward the highest, deadliest elevations of the continent, toward a territory where the snow was stained with the blood of trespassers and where the air smelled sharply of volcanic ash and dark magic. The storm propelled the White Hawk relentlessly toward the obsidian peaks, delivering it to the very doorstep of Gideon Sterling. Ignorant of the wind's betrayal, Cora finally let her grip on the iron bars slip. Her strength gave out completely. She slid down the stack of crates, her body tumbling back onto the freezing stone floor of the cellar in a lifeless heap. The darkness rushed in to claim her, absolute and quiet. She closed her eyes, letting the cold numb the agonizing fire in her chest, believing she had just sent her plea to a gentle savior. She had no idea that a name unspoken for 5 years was about to grow teeth, or that the plea written in her own blood was hurtling directly toward the one man who would tear the world apart to answer it. The wind howled, its violent pitch shinshitting rapidly across the frozen expanse of the continent. 300 miles to the north, the obsidian citadel stood as a brutal, jagged defiance against the sky. Carved directly into the sheer face of the tallest volcanic peak in the continent, the fortress was a monument to absolute, unyielding power. The architecture was dominated by towering spires of black glass and thick, impenetrable walls of basalt. Outside, the early winter solstice blizzard was unleashing a catastrophic fury, a swirling, howling vortex of white snow and dark arcane pressure that battered the high walls. But inside the central war room, the atmosphere was boiling with a completely different kind of localized violence. The chamber was massive, illuminated by the roaring flames of a hearth large enough to roast an entire stag. The air was thick with the scent of burning pine, hot iron, and the heavy, suffocating aura of apex predators tightly wound. At the center of the room stood a sprawling table hewn from a single slab of dark granite. Spread across its surface was a massive map of the surrounding territories, drawn on cured drake hide. Small markers carved from bleached bone and black iron were scattered across the parchment, representing troop movements, enemy encampments, and shifting territorial lines. Devon Cross, the sober-minded commander of the Iron Vanguard, leaned over the table. He moved a cluster of black iron wolf figurines toward a marked border, his heavily scarred face illuminated by the flickering firelight. The Eastern rebel factions are using the storm as cover to reposition their supply lines, the commander reported, his baritone voice a low, steady rumble that commanded immediate respect. He tapped a heavily calloused finger against a jagged mountain pass on the map. If we deploy a scouting unit through the narrow gorge before midnight, we can cut off their grain shipments. It will starve them out before the true winter freeze sets in. We wait for the snow to blind them, then we strike the vanguard. Gideon Sterling did not look at the map. The Lycan King of the Obsidian Peaks stood near the towering, reinforced glass doors of the high balcony, his back to the War Council. He was a terrifying entity to behold, a man whose sheer physical dimensions seemed to swallow the light in the room. Dressed in dark, combat-ready leathers and a loose linen shirt that did little to hide massive, heavily corded muscles of his shoulders, he radiated an aura of lethal, coiled tension. His eyes, a pair of striking, luminous, molten gold irises set in a face of sharp, aristocratic cruelty, were fixed on the raging blizzard outside. He was not listening to the military briefing. For the past 48 hours, an excruciating, inexplicable restlessness had taken residence inside his ribcage. It was not a physical ailment. It was a biological alarm. His inner beast, a legendary, terrifyingly massive shadow wolf that had conquered half the known world, was pacing relentlessly against the bars of his mind. The primal entity was snarling, agitated, clawing at the inside of his skull with a frantic, desperate energy that Gideon could barely suppress. There was a hollowness in his chest, a deep echoing void that had existed for decades, a cold emptiness reserved for a fated mate that the moon goddess had seemingly denied him. But today, that void was vibrating. It felt as though an invisible, incredibly tense wire was being pulled taut across his soul, humming with the static electricity of an impending lightning strike. "My king," Devon prompted, his voice cutting through the heavy silence of the chamber. The commander stepped away from the granite table, sensing the dangerous shift in the atmospheric magic radiating from the Dark Monarch. "Do I have your authorization to sound the horn and deploy the Gorge unit?" Gideon slowly turned his head. The movement was deliberately slow, the fluid, calculated motion of a predator assessing a threat. The ambient temperature in the war room seemed to spike violently just from his shift in focus, the flames in the great hearth roaring higher, feeding on his latent aggression. Before he could speak, a sharp, unnatural sound shattered the tension, thud. It was a frail, hollow impact against the thick black glass of the balcony doors. In the context of the howling blizzard, it should have been completely inaudible. But to the heightened, hypersensitive ears of the Lycan King, the sound cracked like a whip. Gideon's molten gold eyes snapped back to the glass, pressed against the lower pane, shivering violently, and half buried in the accumulating snow on the exterior sill, was a bundle of white feathers. It was a bird, not a common raven or a lowland sparrow, but a rare avian predator native to these exact frozen peaks. The creature was battered, its wings bent at awkward angles, its small chest heaving with desperate, shallow breaths as the freezing wind threatened to sweep it off the stone ledge into the abyss. "A storm stray," Devon noted, stepping up behind his ruler, his hand instinctively resting on the pommel of his broadsword. "The winds are too chaotic, even for the high-altitude hunters. It will be dead in minutes." Gideon did not reply. His gaze was locked not on the dying creature but on its left leg. Wrapped tightly around the birbird's slender limb was a crude, heavy linen thread, securing a torn, crumpled scrap of stiff vellum. The edges of the paper were stained with a dark, rust-colored substance that stood out sharply against the pristine white feathers. The invisible wire in Gideon's chest suddenly pulled so tight it felt ready to snap. He moved with blinding speed. He did not ask for his heavy cloak or signal his guards. He unlatched the heavy iron locking mechanisms of the balcony doors and threw them open. The blizzard instantly invaded the war room. A violent blast of sub-zero air rushed inward, extinguishing a dozen candles in a single breath and sending loose parchment flying off the war table. Devon raised an arm to shield his face from the blinding ice crystals, but the Alpha stepped out into the raging storm without a single flinch. The cold was absolute, but the king did not feel it. The ambient heat of his own dark magic burned just beneath his skin, melting the snowflakes before they could even touch his shoulders. He knelt on the frost-covered stone of the high balcony, his massive frame shielding the shivering bird from the lethal downdrafts. The white hawk did not try to flee. It looked up at the towering predator with dimming amber eyes and let out a weak, raspy trill, extending its left leg. Gideon reached out, his large, calloused fingers, stained with the ink of war maps and the blood of countless enemies, were surprisingly gentle as they moved to untie the frozen linen thread. He pulled the knot free and slipped the stiff vellum from the bird's leg. His bare thumb brushed against the dark-dried paste smeared across the paper. The reaction was instantaneous, catastrophic. The air in Gideon's lungs simply vanished. A physical shockwave, entirely alien and terrifyingly violent, detonated within the center of his chest. It was not a magical attack. It was a visceral, biological transfer of pure agony. A phantom weight, possessing the exact density of a reinforced leather boot, crushed down onto his sternum. The sickening, auditory hallucination of a bone snapping echoed in the cavernous hollow of his skull. The blinding, white-hot agony of a severely fractured third rib flared through his left side, tearing through his muscles and nerve endings with the exact precision of a real injury. Gideon collapsed forward. His heavy knees hit the freezing stone of the balcony with a bone-jarring crack. He braced his massive hands against the obsidian flooring, his head bowing as a strangled, violent roar of pure agony ripped from his throat. The sound drowned out the howling blizzard, a primal, terrifying noise that made the stone beneath him vibrate. The taste of copper flooded his mouth. His vision swam with grey and black spots as his body forcibly simulated the traumatic shock of an injury he had not physically sustained. "My king!" Devon shouted, rushing out onto the balcony, drawing his blade as his eyes desperately scanned the blinding whiteout for an unseen assassin. Where is the threat? Who breached the wards? There was no assassin. There was only the piece of torn paper crushed in the king's massive fist. As the blinding wave of physical pain crested and began to recede into a dull, throbbing ache, the scent finally hit him. The dried paste on the vellum was not just soot, it was blood, but as the warmth of his skin thawed the frozen flakes of rust-colored ink, the true aroma blossomed in the freezing air, bypassing his human senses and striking his inner beast directly in the soul. It was the scent of winter rain hitting crushed pine needles, underscored by the sharp, terrifying metallic tang of profound physical trauma and sheer unadulterated desperation. It was the scent of his other half, the missing piece of his soul, his fated mate, the ancient, dormant magic of the mate bond, dormant for decades suddenly ignited. It did not spark to life with warmth and comfort. It exploded like a dying star, a blinding river of liquid silver that rushed through his veins, connecting his mind to a distant, fading heartbeat hundreds of miles to the south. Through that metaphysical tether, he did not just smell her blood. He felt the freezing temperature of the dark room she was trapped in. He felt the terrifying, agonizing friction of her broken bone, grinding together every time she drew a shallow breath. He felt the absolute hollow despair of a woman preparing to die. The Lycan King lifted his head. The man who had knelt on the balcony was gone. The entity that slowly rose to its feet was a nightmare ripped from the darkest pages of ancient mythology. Gideon's eyes were no longer just gold. They were glowing, radiating a terrifying, blinding luminescence that pierced through the heavy curtain of the blizzard. The veins on his neck and forearms bulged, pulsing with a dark, visible energy as his inner beast clawed violently at the surface of his skin, demanding to be let out. He was a creature entirely consumed by the most primal, violent, protective fury known to their kind. He opened his fist, smoothing out the crumpled vellum with trembling, blood-stained fingers. The letters were frantic, smeared, written with a jagged tool. Alistair. The first word was a mistake. A geographical error orchestrated by the wind. She had not reached out to him. The realization that his mate had sought sanctuary from someone else barely registered over the roaring static in his ears, completely eclipsed by the sheer horror of the next lines. Keith fractured ribs. 3 days until forced mating sanctuary requested. Mother's debt. Save me. Cora. The name physically struck him. It possessed a weight, a gravity that anchored the swirling chaos in his mind. Cora. Then his glowing eyes locked onto the name of the perpetrator, Keith. The atmospheric pressure on the balcony immediately plummeted. The black glass panes of the high doors, engineered to withstand the force of a siege engine, suddenly let out a high-pitched shriek. Dozens of intricate, spiderweb fractures spidered across the reinforced surfaces, buckling under the sheer, oppressive gravity of the king's expanding aura. Devon Cross took a physical step back, his instincts screaming at him to submit, to bare his throat, to flee. The commander had fought beside this man in a dozen wars. He had seen Gideon slaughter entire battalions without blinking, but he had never, in his entire life, witnessed the absolute, unhinged madness that now radiated from the Dark Monarch. "My king," Devon rasped, struggling to breathe in the suffocatingly dense air. "What is it? What does the message say?" Gideon did not look at him. His gaze remained locked on the dried blood of his mate. The throbbing pain in his own ribs was a constant, vicious reminder of her suffering. Every second he stood on this balcony was a second she was bleeding on a freezing floor. "Cancel the gorge deployment," the Alpha snarled. His voice was completely unrecognizable. It was a demonic, double-layered growl that vibrated the marrow in the commander's bones. "Recall all perimeter patrols. Pull every available warrior from the barracks." Devon's eyes widened in sheer military shock. "My king," respectfully, to mobilize the entire vanguard in the middle of a solstice blizzard is tactical suicide. The mountain passes are buried under 10 feet of snow. The beasts will freeze. If it is a rescue mission, allow me to send a specialized covert squad. They can move quietly, bypass the storms. Gideon's head snapped toward the commander. The look in those luminous, molten eyes froze the blood in Devon's veins. There was no military tactician left in that stare. There was only a feral, possessive god of war staring down a minor obstacle. "I will burn the entire kingdom to the ground before I allow that to happen." The Dark Monarch breathed, the words carrying the absolute weight of an executioner's blade. "I am not sending a squad to fetch what is mine. I am marching. And if the snow blocks our path, we will melt the fucking mountains." He shoved past the commander, striding back into the war room with the heavy, ground-shaking steps of a localized earthquake. He ignored the sprawling tactical map on the granite table, sweeping his arm violently to clear a space. Priceless ancient markers, crystal goblets, and inkwells shattered against the stone walls, but he did not care. He marched to the heavy mahogany writing desk in the corner of the room. He did not reach for the standard parchment used for military orders. He yanked open the top drawer and pulled out a thick, heavy sheet of pristine white royal vellum, stamped with the crest of the obsidian peaks in silver foil. He snatched a heavy iron quill from the inkwell. He did not care for diplomatic pleasantries. He did not write a lengthy reassurance or a strategic plan. His massive hand locked, the sharp nib of the quill nearly tearing through the thick surface of the expensive paper as he dragged it aggressively across the page. He wrote 4 words, a command, a promise, an absolute decree of survival. Stay right there. He did not sign it. He didn't need to. The sheer amount of dark, territorial magic bleeding from his fingertips seeped directly into the paper, embedding the ink with the overwhelming scent of roasted pine, ozone, and unyielding protection. Gideon turned back toward the balcony. The white bird was still huddled on the freezing stone, its life force flickering like a candle in the wind, completely incapable of making a return flight. The king knelt beside the dying creature. He pressed his massive, calloused palm against the bird's frail chest. He did not just heal the creature, he forced a surge of his own boiling, volatile alpha magic directly into its small heart. The bird's eyes snapped open, blazing with a sudden unnatural golden light. Its bent wings snapped back into perfect alignment with a sickening crunch that the creature did not seem to feel. It let out a piercing, invigorated shriek, suddenly vibrating with the borrowed endurance of a lichen king. Gideon bound the heavy royal paper to the bird's uninjured leg using a thick strip of leather, torn directly from his own gauntlet. "Find her," he commanded the avian messenger, his voice a low, terrifying rumble of absolute authority. "Do not stop for the wind. Do not stop for predators. You will drop this into her hands, or I will hunt you down and tear your wings from your body myself. Go." He threw his arm upward, launching the creature into the abyss. The bird did not falter this time. Empowered by the raw, boiling magic of the apex predator, it shot straight through the violent downdrafts like a white arrow, cutting a direct path south through the chaotic black clouds. As he watched the tiny speck disappear into the storm, the tether in his chest pulled tight again. He closed his eyes, projecting the full, terrifying weight of his presence down that invisible golden thread, bypassing distance, bypassing the storm, reaching directly into the freezing darkness where she lay. The word thundered through their soul bond like a war drum. "Mine." Gideon turned his back on the storm. He stalked across the war room toward the heavy iron hooks on the far wall. He grabbed his massive, heavy wolf fur cloak, the pelt of a shadow beast he had slaughtered with his bare hands a century ago, and threw it violently over his broad shoulders. The heavy silver clasps snapped into place with the sound of a guillotine dropping. He looked at Devon Cross. The commander was already standing at rigid attention, having recognized that any further objection would result in his immediate execution. With an immediate, low-register authority that bridged the shift from internal rage to active military mobilization, Gideon spoke. "Sound the iron vanguard horn." The command did not leave the Dark Monarch's lips as a shout. It was a low, guttural vibration that bypassed the auditory canals entirely, resonating directly in the marrow of the men standing in the war room. Devon Cross did not hesitate. The commander gave a crisp, rigid bow, turning on his heel with military precision. His heavy boots pounded against the obsidian floor as he crossed the chamber, throwing his weight against the iron levers that controlled the internal communication shafts of the citadel. He pulled the heavy chains downward. Deep within the bowels of the mountain fortress, gears the size of houses began to grind. A moment later, the sound erupted. The iron vanguard horn was an ancient artifact, a massive instrument carved from the hollowed tusk of a primordial shadow wolf, mounted on the highest parapet of the citadel. When blown, it did not produce a simple musical note. It released a localized seismic event. A deep, terrifying bellow tore through the raging blizzard, a sound so profoundly heavy that it shook the dust from the vaulted ceilings of the war room and caused the remaining crystal goblets on the granite table to fracture into 1,000 pieces. It was a sound that the surrounding territories had not heard in over 50 years. It was the absolute, undeniable declaration of total war. Gideon did not wait for his generals to assemble. He stalked out of the chamber, his massive frame moving with a fluid, terrifying velocity that defied his sheer bulk. He descended the spiraling basalt staircases of the fortress, bypassing the upper armories and heading directly for the subterranean beast pens. The temperature dropped significantly as he entered the caverns, the air turning thick with the pungent, heavy musk of raw meat, wet fur, and contained aggression. Hundreds of massive iron cages lined the cavern walls, holding the terrifying mounts of the royal army. These were not horses. They were dire beasts, colossal predators bred in the shadows of the volcanic peaks, possessing jaws capable of snapping a grown man in half. Usually the pens were a cacophony of snarls and rattling chains, requiring dozens of handlers with electrified pikes to maintain order. Today the cavern was completely, terrifyingly silent. As the Lichen King stepped onto the cavern floor, Every single beast in the facility dropped its massive head to the stone, whimpering in absolute submission. The animals could feel the suffocating, unhinged atmospheric pressure radiating from the sovereign. They smelt the boiling, volatile magic bleeding from his pores, thick with the aroma of smouldering evergreen and ozone, underscored by a violent protective fury that overrode their wild instincts. Devon marched in closely behind his ruler, already strapping a heavy iron broadsword to his back. The commander signaled the elite riders, who were frantically pouring into the pens, their faces pale but their movements disciplined. "Saddle the vanguard!" Devon roared, his voice echoing off the damp cavern walls. "Every available rider, light armor, heavy weapons, we march into the storm." Gideon walked straight to the largest enclosure at the end of the cavern. The iron bars were as thick as tree trunks. Inside paced a nightmare of solid black muscle and razor-sharp bone plating, the king's personal mount. The creature stopped its restless pacing as the master approached, lowering its massive armored snout to the iron bars. The monarch reached through the enclosure, pressing his bare hand against the beast's cold, leathery snout. The connection was instantaneous. Through the tactile contact, the giant predator sensed the phantom agony radiating from Gideon's fractured third rib. The beast's eyes turned a luminous, glowing gold, mirroring the terrifying luminescence of its master's irises. It let out a low, rumbling growl that vibrated the ground, completely synchronized with the man's feral desperation. There was no need for a saddle. Gideon vaulted over the high iron gate with impossible agility, landing squarely on the broad, armored back of the shadow beast. He wrapped his fists tightly into the coarse, thick fur at the nape of the creature's neck. "Raise the lower gates," the king commanded, his glowing eyes fixed on the heavy steel portcullis at the end of the tunnel. A dozen soldiers scrambled to the winches. The massive chains groaned in protest, hauling the heavy steel barrier upward. The moment a gap appeared, the violent winter solstice blizzard came roaring into the tunnel, a blinding wall of white ice and freezing wind that threatened to push the soldiers backward. Gideon did not wait for the gate to open fully. He dug his heels into the flanks of his mount. The giant predator surged forward, launching itself through the narrow opening and landing heavily in the 10-foot snowdrifts outside the fortress walls. Behind him, the synchronized thundering of 500 massive paws echoed through the tunnel as the first wave of the elite army followed their king into the frozen abyss. The mountain passes were supposed to be impassable. The sheer volume of snow and the chaotic magical downdrafts should have frozen any marching army in its tracks within miles. But the vanguard was not navigating the storm alone. Riding at the absolute apex of the formation, Gideon unleashed his aura completely. The ambient temperature around the towering sovereign spiked to lethal levels. The dark, boiling magic radiated outward in a massive, invisible dome, hitting the blinding snow before it could even touch the beasts. The 10-foot drifts in their immediate path began to melt and vaporize upon contact, creating a steaming, wet corridor of exposed rock through the heart of the blizzard. It was a catastrophic drain on his physical and magical reserves. To sustain this level of thermal output across miles of frozen terrain would eventually tear a normal alpha's heart to pieces, but the phantom pain throbbing in his chest was a constant, vicious whip driving him forward. Every shallow breath he felt through the golden thread of the mate bond was another log thrown onto the furnace of his rage. He leaned low over the neck of his mount, his silver-clasped wolf fur cloak whipping violently in the chaotic winds. The armor plunged southward down the sheer mountain face, a river of black iron and dark magic, cutting through the white death of the north, leaving nothing but steam and melted stone in their wake. Hundreds of miles to the south, the world was completely devoid of heat. Cora Vance drifted in a vast, silent ocean of grey numbness. The transition from unconsciousness back to the waking world was agonizingly slow, her mind fighting a desperate battle against the seductive, painless void of the dark. The first sensation that registered was the cold. It was no longer just an environmental factor. It had become a physical entity, a heavy, suffocating blanket of frost that had settled over her skin, sinking deep into her muscles and stiffening her joints. Her eyelashes were frozen together, requiring a concentrated, painful effort to pry open. When her vision finally cleared, The dim, frost-rimmed expanse of the Silvertooth subterranean pantry swam into view. Nothing had changed. The heavy iron door remained sealed. The ancient, rusted fireplace sat empty in the corner. The pile of discarded wooden crates loomed like a mocking monument to her failed escape attempt. A quiet, involuntary shiver racked her small frame. The sudden movement immediately triggered the fractured bone in her chest. A sharp, blinding spike of agony radiated from her sternum, stealing the sparse oxygen from her lungs. She gasped, a weak, wet sound, curling her uninjured side inward in a desperate attempt to protect the broken rib. The metallic taste of copper pooled under her tongue again. She pressed the side of her face against the freezing stone floor, her stormy, silver-flecked eyes staring blankly at the rough granite. The gamble had failed. The realization settled over her with the quiet, devastating weight of an avalanche. She had poured the last dregs of her strength, her very blood, into that parchment of desperation. She had entrusted her survival to a fragile, broken bird, flying into a winter solstice storm. It was a fool's hope. The hawk was likely frozen solid in a snowbank, somewhere just beyond the manor walls, the bloody parchment buried under layers of ice. Alistair would never receive the message. No one was coming to the southern borders to save a wolfless Omega from a political slaughter. She was going to die here. If the freezing temperatures did not claim her heart by morning, Keith would drag her hypothermic, broken body to the altar and hand her over to a monster. Cora closed her eyes, seeking a small measure of dignity in the absolute silence. She would not let them hear her cry. She would not leave a stain of weak tears on this cellar floor for her stepbrother to mock. She focused on the erratic, shallow thumping of her own pulse, counting the beats, anchoring her mind to the simple mechanical act of existing for one more second. Then the silence broke. It was a faint, metallic scraping sound coming from high above. Cora's eyes snapped open. She did not move her body, terrified that the noise was just a cruel auditory hallucination born of a dying brain. But the sound came again, slightly louder this time, the sharp clatter of claws against iron bars. With an agonizing, deliberate effort, she tilted her head upward, her gaze finding the narrow, heavily barred ventilation grate near the ceiling. Pushing its way through the narrow gap between the rusted iron bars was a bundle of white feathers. The frostwing hawk had returned. Cora stared in absolute, stunned disbelief as the bird squeezed through the grate and dropped lightly onto the stack of wooden crates. It hopped down the makeshift stairs of rotting wood, its movements sharp and precise, entirely devoid of the frail, freezing clumsiness it had exhibited just hours ago. As the creature reached the stone floor and approached her face, Cora noticed something terrifyingly wrong. The bird was radiating heat. It was not the natural, fragile warmth of a small animal. It was a dense, heavy, almost oppressive thermal output. The frost clinging to the floor stones around the hawk's talons was actively melting, turning into small pools of water. The bird's amber eyes, previously dull with exhaustion, were now glowing with a faint, unnatural golden luminescence. The hawk stopped inches from her nose. It let out a sharp, commanding trill and extended its left leg. Tied securely to the limb was not the crude, blood-stained scrap of ledger paper she had sent. Cora's trembling, raw fingers reached out. She fumbled with a thick strip of premium black leather that had been used to bind the message, her numb joints protesting the delicate movement. The knot was military-grade, tied with brutal efficiency, but she eventually worked it loose. The paper fell into her palm. The tactile sensation alone was enough to send a shockwave of confusion through her exhausted mind. This was not discarded packing material. It was thick, heavy, flawlessly pressed parchment. Her thumb brushed against the top corner, feeling the raised, embossed texture of a silver foil crest. She recognized the heraldry immediately from her mother's old geography texts. It was the jagged, towering mountain insignia of the Obsidian Peaks. Alistair did not live in the north. He lived in the southern lowlands. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her numbness. Where had the wind taken her blood? Who had intercepted her plea? With shaking hands, she unfolded the heavy sheet. The air in the freezing cellar suddenly shifted. As the paper opened, it released a trapped pocket of scent that hit Cora's senses with the force of a physical blow. It was an overwhelming, intoxicating aroma of charred cedar needles, heavy ozone, and rain hitting hot stones. The smell was so dense, so aggressively dominant, that it entirely masked the metallic stench of her own dried blood and the rotting wood of the cellar. The moment she inhaled the scent, a violent, terrifying reaction occurred deep within her chest. It felt as though a dormant, invisible spark had been struck against dry kindling inside her soul. A sudden, rushing warmth exploded in her sternum, completely bypassing her fractured rib. It was a sensation of pure, liquid silver flooding her veins, pushing back the hypothermic chill that had been slowly killing her. Her erratic heartbeat suddenly stabilized, locking into a deep, powerful rhythm that felt entirely foreign, as if her heart were suddenly beating in sync with a massive, distant war drum. She gasped, her grey eyes widening in absolute terror and awe. The pain in her side dulled to a distant ache, buffered by an invisible, heavily scented shield of atmospheric magic. With shaking hands, she held the Royal Vellum command up to the meagre light filtering through the grate. There was no diplomatic greeting, there was no signature. There were only 4 words, written in thick, aggressive black ink. The handwriting was brutal, the stroke so deeply gouged into the expensive paper that the sharp quill had nearly torn right through the heavy fibre. Stay right there. The words were not a request. They were an absolute territorial decree. Cora stared at the black ink, her breath catching in her throat. The command resonated with the strange, sudden warmth blooming in her chest. It was a promise of violence, a promise of protection. She did not know whose hands had marred this royal paper, nor did she understand why a northern monarch would bother to answer the desperate scribbles of a wolfless Omega. But, as she clutched the thick vellum to her chest, pressing the silver crest directly over her heart, the oppressive terror of the dark cellar began to recede. For the first time since the snap of her rib, Cora felt a dangerous, fragile ember of hope. The quiet moment of sanctuary lasted exactly 3 hours. The heavy iron deadbolt of the subterranean pantry slid back with a loud, metallic shriek that echoed off the stone walls. The massive wooden door was violently kicked open, slamming against the interior wall with enough force to send a shower of loose mortar raining down on the floor. Keith stood framed in the doorway, a silhouette of petty tyranny against the torchlight of the manor hallway. He was dressed in immaculate, ceremonial dark grey leathers, the silver wolf-head clasps of his cloak polished to a mirror shine. His face, however, was twisted into a mask of ugly, barely contained rage. The acting alpha stepped into the freezing room, his heavy boots crunching loudly over the patches of ice near the entrance. The emissary's carriage has crossed the outer perimeter. The stepbrother snarled, his voice echoing in the confined space. They are early. The allied alpha demands his property before the storm worsens. I told you to prepare yourself, you worthless wretch. Get up. Cora did not move immediately. She lay on her uninjured side, her back pressed against the cold wall. Her right hand was tucked tightly against her chest, hidden within the folds of her ruined linen dress, her fingers curled desperately around the heavy royal paper. I cannot walk, she stated. Her voice was surprisingly steady, a quiet, cold thread of sound that cut through his blustering anger. She kept her head bowed, refusing to meet his eyes, preserving the quiet dignity that always infuriated him. The bone is unstable. If I stand, it will shift. Keith let out a sharp, mocking laugh. He crossed the small distance between them in 2 massive strides. He did not care about medical realities. He cared only about the consolidation of his power and the elimination of his mother's mistake. He reached down, his heavy leather gloves grabbing handfuls of her torn dress at the shoulders. I do not care if it punctures your heart the moment the ceremony is over, the man hissed, his breath smelling of stale wine and nervous sweat. You will stand and you will walk out to that carriage, or I will drag you by your hair through the mud. With a violent upward jerk, he hauled her off the floor. The pain was instantaneous and absolute. The fractured edges of her third rib ground together with a sickening friction that sent a shockwave of blinding white agony through her nervous system. Cora's knees buckled immediately, her body attempting to collapse back to the floor to protect the injury, but Keith held her up by the fabric of her dress, shaking her roughly. A sharp, strangled gasp tore from her lips, but she bit down brutally on the inside of her cheek. The metallic taste of fresh blood flooded her mouth, but she swallowed the scream. She would not give him the satisfaction. Move, he commanded, shoving her toward the open doorway. Cora stumbled, her bare, bleeding feet slapping against the freezing stone. She caught herself against the doorframe, her left arm wrapped tightly around her midsection, her right hand still clutching the hidden vellum. Every breath was a jagged knife tearing through her lung. The journey out of the cellar and up the narrow, winding stone stairs was a descent into a waking nightmare. Keith did not offer assistance. He walked behind her, shoving her shoulder whenever she paused to gather the strength for the next step. Her vision swam, the torchlight of the manor corridors blurring into long, fiery streaks. They emerged from the subterranean levels into the grand hallway of the Silvertooth Manor. The space was bustling with anxious activity. Servants rushed past carrying trays of hot food and ceremonial tapestries, preparing for the arrival of the terrifying allied Alpha. Pack warriors stood near the heavy oak doors, their hands resting nervously on the pommels of their swords. As Keith dragged the injured woman into the light, the hallway went dead silent. The servants stopped in their tracks, lowering their eyes to the floor in abject terror. The warriors shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the brutal cruelty playing out before them, but none stepped forward. The law of the pack was absolute. The acting Alpha's word was law, and the wolfless Omega had no rights, no protector, and no value beyond her political price tag. Cora felt the weight of their averted gazes. It was a familiar, suffocating isolation. She was entirely alone in a house full of cowards. Throw the main doors wide. Keith barked at the guards, his grip tightening on her arm. We will wait for him in the courtyard. Let the cold remind her of her place. The massive oak doors were hauled wide, letting the roaring violence of the winter solstice blizzard spill into the grand hallway. The wind howled, a bitter, freezing gale that immediately bit into Cora's exposed skin. Keith shoved her forward, forcing her out onto the grand stone steps of the manor entrance and down into the open, snow-covered expanse of the main courtyard. The storm here was chaotic, spinning snow in blinding white sheets. The temperature was brutal, but to Cora, it felt fundamentally different from the dead, stagnant cold of the cellar. The wind outside carried a faint, strange electrical charge. Keith released her abruptly, stepping back to avoid getting snow on his polished boots. Without his support, Cora's legs finally gave out. She collapsed into the snowdrift, landing hard on her knees. She bowed her head, her silver-white hair falling forward to shield her face from the biting wind, her left arm locked rigidly across her broken chest. You will kneel here until his carriage pulls through those gates, the stepbrother announced loudly, ensuring his voice carried back to the cowardly pack members, watching from the warmth of the open manor doors. He was making a public spectacle of her submission, cementing his absolute dominance over the weakest link in their bloodline. When he steps out, you will offer your neck. If you hesitate, if you show even a fraction of disrespect, I will break the rest of your ribs myself. Cora did not look up at him. She did not tremble, despite the freezing snow soaking through her thin dress. With deliberate care, she uncurled her right fist. Resting in her palm, completely untouched by the melting snow, was the heavy royal vellum command. The silver foil crest gleamed dully in the chaotic grey light of the storm. The thick black ink of the 4 words seemed to pulse with a dark, latent energy. That distinctive aura of dark woods and ozone flared again, cutting sharply through the smell of the blizzard. It wrapped around her shivering shoulders like a heavy, invisible cloak. The strange, powerful rhythm in her chest beat steadily, a calming, grounding force that made the petty tyrant standing over her seem incredibly small. She wasn't alone. The realization settled into her bones, solid and undeniable. She didn't know who had written the command. She didn't know how far away they were, but the ancient, terrifying power radiating from the paper in her hand told her one absolute truth. The owner of that handwriting did not make empty threats. Cora lifted her head. She stared up at Keith through the swirling snow. Her pale, tempestuous eyes were completely devoid of fear. There were no tears, no silent pleas for mercy. There was only a cold, impenetrable pride anchored by the dark magic resting against her skin. I am not going anywhere, she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly over the howling wind. Keith's face flushed a violent, ugly shade of red. The quiet defiance in her eyes was a direct challenge to his authority in front of his entire pack. He had broken her bones, starved her, and humiliated her. Yet she sat in the snow looking at him with the calm detachment of a queen observing a peasant. "You insolent little bitch," the man snarled, his humanity slipping as the edges of his own unstable, aggressive wolf surfaced. He took a heavy step forward, his leather glove balling into a massive fist, drawing his arm back to deliver a crushing blow to her face. Cora did not flinch. She simply tightened her grip on the vellum and waited. The leather-clad fist never connected. In the fraction of a second, before the brutal impact could shatter her jaw, the atmospheric pressure within the Silvertooth courtyard underwent a catastrophic, localized collapse. The howling winter solstice blizzard did not simply pause. The chaotic winds were violently sucked upward, creating a terrifying, breathless vacuum. The snowflakes suspended in mid-air, frozen by a sudden, overwhelming density that possessed a physical, crushing weight. The ambient temperature, already hovering near freezing, seemed to instantly drop, snapping the moisture in the air into static, electrified frost. Then the earth heaved. It was not a tremor. It was a seismic detonation. The towering, reinforced oak and iron main gates of the manor, structures engineered to withstand a direct siege from rival armies for weeks, did not merely break open. They were completely, absolutely pulverized. A deafening roar, like a thunderclap trapped inside a narrow canyon, tore through the courtyard. Massive splinters of ancient wood, some the size of javelins, exploded inward. Twisted chunks of black iron hinges shrapnelled across the snow, embedding themselves deep into the stone walls of the surrounding keep with metallic screeches. The sheer kinetic force of the breach sent a shockwave ripping across the grounds, a violent blast of displaced air that physically lifted the Silvertooth pack warriors off their feet and threw them backward into the snowdrifts. Keith's descending arm froze mid-strike. The acting alpha stumbled, his pristine boots slipping on the ice as the ground beneath him vibrated with a terrifying rhythmic thudding. It was not the chaotic stampede of a wild horde. It was the synchronized, ground-shaking footfalls of apex predators marching in perfect, lethal unison. Through the billowing clouds of pulverized wood and blinding snow dust, they emerged, a tidal wave of solid black muscle, razor-sharp bone plating, and glowing golden eyes poured through the ruined archway. The elite riders of the Northern Army did not charge with wild, undisciplined war cries. They moved with a terrifying, silent, military precision that spoke of centuries of absolute dominance. Hundreds of giant shadow beasts fanned out across the courtyard in a matter of seconds, their massive paws crushing the fallen debris into dust. The armored warriors on their backs sat perfectly rigid, their heavy broadswords drawn, the dark steel glinting menacingly in the dim stormlight. The temperature in the courtyard immediately spiked. The bitter, stagnant cold of the southern blizzard was forcefully overwritten by an oppressive, boiling heat radiating from the invading force. The heavy, suffocating fragrance of sun-baked resin and ozone flooded the space, a pure, unadulterated projection of territorial dominance that bypassed human rationale and struck directly at the primal souls of everyone present. The Silvertooth wolves did not even attempt to fight. As the sheer magnitude of the invading aura crashed down upon them, their biological instincts violently overrode their loyalty to their petty tyrant. It was an involuntary, mass submission. All across the courtyard, the terrified guards and warriors dropped to their knees, gasping for air in the suffocatingly dense atmosphere. They pressed their foreheads against the melting snow, exposing their throats in absolute, whimpering surrender to a power they could not even comprehend. They were completely outmatched, fundamentally outclassed by the sheer overwhelming presence of the North. Keith Thorne stood completely paralyzed, his arms still awkwardly raised, his face drained of all color. The ugly flushed red of his previous rage vanished, replaced by the pale, sickly white of a man who suddenly realized he was standing on the tracks of a runaway avalanche. His heart hammered frantically against his ribs, his breath catching in his throat as his arrogant worldview fractured into a million irreparable pieces. The ranks of the elite northern vanguard seamlessly parted down the center, creating a wide, steaming corridor of melted snow that led directly to where Cora knelt. Through that corridor strode the largest shadow beast of them all. The creature was a nightmare of feral majesty, its massive shoulders towering over the tallest Silvertooth guards, its jaws dripping with hot saliva that turned to steam the moment it hit the freezing air. The beast moved with a terrifying predatory grace, its golden eyes locked onto the shivering form of the woman on the ground, and riding upon its armored back was the god of war himself. Gideon Sterling was a titan of dark leather and thick fur, his massive frame absorbing the sparse light of the courtyard. The silver clasps of his heavy cloak gleamed sharply, but it was his eyes that locked the entire world in place. They were a pair of luminous, molten gold irises burning with a feral, unhinged protective fury that defied human description. The volcanic heat rolling off his body was so intense that the heavy snowdrifts in a 10-foot radius around his mount instantly vaporized, leaving nothing but bare, steaming cobblestones in his wake. Gideon vaulted from the back of the giant predator before it even came to a full stop. The heavy thud of his boots, striking the stone, echoed like a judge's gavel in the dead silence of the courtyard. He did not draw a weapon. He did not shout a battle cry. He simply began to walk. His massive strides were slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly fluid. Every step he took seemed to increase the gravitational pull in the area. The air grew impossibly thin. The scent of ozone sharpened, crackling with invisible static electricity that raised the hairs on the back of every neck in the courtyard. A lone, panicked Silvertooth loyalist, acting purely on adrenaline rather than logic, shakily raised a spear toward the advancing monarch. He never even got to step forward. Devon Cross, riding just behind his ruler, did not issue a command or raise his voice. The sober-minded commander simply shifted his weight in the saddle. His dire beast lunged with blinding speed, its massive jaws snapping the thick wooden shaft of the spear in half like a dry twig. Simultaneously, Devon's broadsword blurred through the air, stopping a fraction of an inch from the loyalist's trembling jugular. The message was absolute, total, undeniable subjugation. Gideon ignored the display entirely. His glowing eyes were locked onto a single target. Keith Thorne took a frantic, staggering step backward, his boots sliding in the slush. The arrogant facade of the acting alpha crumbled completely, revealing the cowardly core of a bully who had finally encountered a true monster. His jaw worked silently, desperate to form a diplomatic greeting, a plea, an excuse, anything to redirect the lethal, coiled tension bearing down on him. My lord, Keith stammered, his voice cracking, completely devoid of the booming authority he had used to terrorize the subterranean pantry. There has been a misunderstanding. We are a sovereign pack. The borders. Gideon did not stop, he did not slow down. When he reached the trembling tyrant, the Dark Monarch's right hand shot forward with the speed of a striking viper. His massive, calloused fingers wrapped completely around the thick leather collar of the stepbrother's ceremonial tunic, digging deep into the flesh of the throat beneath. With a single, violent upward motion, Gideon lifted the full-grown man entirely off his feet. The acting alpha gagged, his polished boots kicking helplessly in the empty air as he was suspended inches above the ground. His hands clawed desperately at the immovable, iron-like forearm of the Alpha King, trying to break a grip that could crush boulders. You touched what is mine. The voice that emanated from Gideon Sterling did not sound human. It was a demonic, double-layered growl that vibrated with such intense malice it made the surrounding air physically ripple. The heat radiating from his skin flared, hot enough that the leather of Keith's tunic actually began to singe and smoke beneath his grip. The distinct smell of burning hide mingled with the metallic tang of fear. She is a wolfless Omega, the suspended man gasped out, his eyes bulging as oxygen deprivation set in, still clinging desperately to the pathetic hierarchies of his insignificant worldview. She was meant to be a political offering, a trade. She is nothing. The golden irises of the towering ruler flared with a blinding, catastrophic light. Not used, not owned, chosen. The signature decree sliced through the freezing air, absolute and terrifying. Gideon did not merely declare it. He carved the truth into the atmosphere with the sheer weight of his aura. He was rewriting the laws of the Silvertooth Pack in real time, stripping away the decades of humiliation and abuse with 4 words. Then the king delivered his judgment. He did not use a blade. A blade was too fast, too merciful for the crimes committed in that freezing cellar. He used his free left hand, the massive, heavily scarred palm pressed flat against the center of Keith's chest, right over his immaculate ceremonial leathers. Gideon's glowing eyes narrowed, calculating the exact anatomy, the precise architecture of the bone structure beneath the fabric. Through the golden thread of the mate bond, he could feel the exact hollow ache of Cora's fractured bone. He sought to mirror that trauma perfectly. He applied pressure. It was not a sudden strike, but a slow, methodical, inexorable crushing force. The terrified man's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror as he realized what was happening. He opened his mouth to scream, but the grip on his throat strangled the sound into a pathetic, high-pitched wheeze. The first snap was sickeningly loud, echoing clearly across the dead silence of the courtyard. It was the third rib on the left side, the exact bone that had been shattered in the dark. Gideon did not stop. He shifted his palm a fraction of an inch higher. The pressure increased. A second violent crack ripped through the air. Then a third. The brutal, mechanical sounds of bone, splintering under immense controlled pressure, were accompanied by the wet, gurgling sobs of a broken tyrant. Gideon Sterling was systematically dismantling the physical foundation of the man's arrogance, inflicting the exact, agonizing trauma with a terrifying, surgical precision. He was making sure the pain was symmetrical, ensuring that every shallow breath this creature took for the rest of his miserable life would serve as a brutal reminder of the woman he had dared to hurt. When the fourth rib gave way, Gideon finally released his grip on the throat. The shattered man dropped to the steaming cobblestones like a discarded rag doll. Keith curled into a tight, agonizing fetal position, coughing violently, dark blood spattering his pristine grey leathers. He clutched his ruined chest, entirely incapable of standing, stripped of his title, his pride, and his health in less than 60 seconds. He wept openly, a pathetic sound that garnered no sympathy from the iron-clad warriors surrounding him. The Dark Monarch stepped over the weeping, broken body without a second glance. The retribution was exacted. The threat was neutralized. Now his feral inner beast demanded the only thing that mattered. Gideon turned his attention toward the snowdrift. Cora Vance was exactly where the tyrant had dropped her. She was kneeling in the slush, her silver-white hair plastered to her freezing cheeks, her left arm still wrapped rigidly around her midsection. Her bare, bleeding feet were sinking into the icy mud, but she kept her head bowed and her spine straight. Her right hand was pressed fiercely over her heart, clutching the thick, silver-crested royal vellum command as if it were a physical shield against the world. She did not cry. She did not shake. She simply endured, possessing a high, unbroken dignity that humbled the very air around her. As the towering, lethal warlord took a step toward her, the terrifying, unhinged violence that had just pulverized a man's ribcage instantly vanished. The overwhelming, aggressive atmospheric pressure was violently reeled in, pulled back on an iron leash of sheer willpower. The ambient temperature, previously burning hot enough to singe leather, rapidly cooled to a deep, radiating warmth, a soothing, heavy hearth fire designed to comfort rather than consume. The feral, glowing gold of his eyes softened, the irises dimming into a rich, deep amber filled with an aching, desperate reverence. The transition from a god of destruction to a man falling to his knees was breathtaking. Gideon dropped his massive frame into the snow right in front of her. The ice hissed and melted into warm water beneath his heavy combat boots and armored knee guards. Up close, the sheer physical dimensions of the Alpha King were overwhelming. His broad shoulders completely blocked out the chaotic swirling of the blizzard, creating a localized, perfectly calm sanctuary just for her. For a long, agonizing moment, neither of them spoke. Silence. Cora stared up into the face of the legend. The sharp, aristocratic angles of his jaw were tight with restrained emotion. She saw the dark smudges of exhaustion under his luminous, the physical toll of burning a path through hundreds of miles of impassable winter mountains without rest. And in the very center of his chest, mirroring her exact injury, she sensed the dull phantom throb of shared agony. She slowly uncurled her right fist, revealing the slightly crumpled royal vellum command. The blood she had used to write her plea on the parchment of desperation seemed like a distant nightmare compared to the heavy, silver-stamped reality of his response. "I stayed right here," she whispered, her voice a fragile, broken thread of sound, incredibly quiet but carrying a monumental weight. A ragged, shuddering breath tore its way out of Gideon's chest. The sight of her raw, bleeding knuckles, the pale, hypothermic blue of her lips, and the sheer, unbroken dignity in her slate-colored gaze completely shattered the last of his legendary composure. The man who had just shattered a fortress gate with his mere presence looked as though his own heart had been ripped from his chest. He reached out, his massive hands, stained with the soot of war maps and the blood of his enemies, were trembling visibly. When his fingertips finally brushed against the freezing skin of her cheek, the reaction was instantaneous. The mate bond, previously a distant, agonizing tether of shared pain, snapped fully and permanently into place like a key turning in an ancient lock. It was an explosion of sensory perfection. A rushing, molten river of liquid silver flooded through both of their nervous systems, connecting mind, soul, and flesh. The physical shock of the connection sent a violent shudder through Cora's small frame. The freezing, stagnant cold that had been slowly killing her in the cellar was instantly banished, replaced by a profound, piercing warmth that sank deep into her bones. It wrapped around her fractured rib like a protective, magical ksa, immediately easing the sharp, jagged agony of her breathing. Gideon closed his eyes, leaning his forehead gently against hers. He inhaled deeply, drawing the scent of her into his lungs, letting the reality of her survival anchor his frantic inner beast. The frantic thudding of his heart began to synchronize perfectly with hers. "I know," the Dark Monarch rasped, his voice thick with a raw, desperate devotion that no other living soul had ever heard. "I have you. You will never feel the cold again." With agonizing care, the towering Alpha reached up and unfastened the heavy silver clasps at his throat. He pulled the massive shadow beast fur cloak from his own shoulders. The garment was incredibly thick, lined with soft, dark wool, and permanently infused with his intense, grounding musk of toasted cedar and ozone. He draped the heavy cloak around her shivering shoulders, pulling the thick fur tightly across her chest, to completely isolate her from the biting wind and the stares of the terrified courtyard. The sheer weight of the garment was immense, but it was a comforting, grounding pressure that made her feel instantly, fundamentally safe. Then he prepared to move her. He did not simply scoop her up. He was acutely, terrifyingly aware of the unstable bone in her chest. His massive hands mapped the safest points of contact with surgical precision. He slid his left arm low beneath her knees, avoiding her bare, bleeding feet. His right arm went around her back, his wide palm spreading out to support the entire length of her spine, ensuring her ribcage remained perfectly immobilized. "Hold your breath for 1 second, my heart," he murmured, his amber eyes locking onto her grey ones, warning her of the shift in gravity. Cora inhaled a shallow sip of air and braced herself. Gideon stood up. The motion was incredibly smooth, executed with the fluid, calculated grace of a predator, ensuring its fragile cargo did not suffer even a millimeter of unnecessary friction. He absorbed the entire burden of her weight into his massive chest, locking his arms so that she was held flush against the solid, burning heat of his torso. As her head dropped against the dark leather of his combat tunic, right over the steady, thunderous beating of his heart, a profound physical relief washed over the injured woman. The sheer, overwhelming power of the man holding her was an impenetrable fortress. The cruelty of her stepbrother, the terror of the cellar, the threat of the bordering packs, it all vanished, rendered completely irrelevant by the absolute authority of the arms wrapping around her. She pressed her face deeper into the thick fur of his cloak, inhaling the intoxicating, protective scent of her fated mate. "I would rather burn with you than freeze alone," she thought, the silent confession echoing clearly down the newly forged silver thread connecting their souls. She felt the deep rumble of a low, comforting growl vibrate in his chest, a clear acknowledgement of her silent vow. Gideon turned away from the bleeding, broken-acting Alpha whimpering on the cobblestones. He ignored the hundreds of Silvertooth pack members, still kneeling in the slush, their faces pressed to the earth in terrified submission. They were beneath his notice. They were ghosts of a past he was permanently erasing. He carried her toward the center of the vanguard formation, where the giant shadow beast waited patiently, its massive armored head lowered in respect to the fragile woman in its master's arms. Devon Cross signaled the elite riders, their broadswords returning to their scabbards with a synchronized metallic ring that cut through the dying blizzard. The Dark Monarch had delivered his retribution, claimed his sovereignty, and secured his mate's future in a single, earth-shattering afternoon. The rhythm of the giant predator carrying them northward was surprisingly smooth, a fluid, ground-eating lope that defied the chaotic violence of the winter solstice blizzard. Tucked securely against the solid, radiating furnace of Gideon Sterling's chest, Cora Vance experienced a bizarre suspension of reality. The howling wind and driving snow were visible just beyond the edge of Gideon's shadow beast fur cloak, yet not a single ice crystal touched her skin. The dark monarch had enveloped them in a localized sphere of his own boiling aura, burning through magical reserves at a catastrophic rate, simply to ensure the freezing air never reached her shattered bone. Cora drifted in a haze of exhaustion and newly awakened mate magic. The memory of Keith Thorne's reinforced boot connecting with her side still ghosted along her nerve endings. She had not screamed when it happened. She had not begged when he had dragged her across the courtyard. Because begging wouldn't have changed the outcome. She had simply focused on surviving the next second, and then the next. Now suspended in the unnatural, burning heat of the Alpha King's protective embrace, the sheer contrast threatened to break her composure more thoroughly than Keith ever could. Every time the fractured edge of her third rib threatened to grind together under the momentum of the ride, a pulse of liquid silver would rush through her veins, originating from the massive hand splayed carefully across her spine. He was actively managing her pain through the golden thread connecting their souls, absorbing the sharpest spikes of agony into his own massive frame. When the terrifyingly sheer black walls of the obsidian citadel finally materialized out of the whiteout, there was no grand trumpet blast or shouted military orders. The massive iron gate simply began to rise the moment the Sovereign's towering silhouette became visible to the watchtowers, groaning heavily against the accumulation of ice. The transition from the lethal, frozen wilderness into the absolute security of the northern fortress was a physical shock. The air inside the cavernous entry hall was heavy, still, and significantly warmer, heated by massive subterranean geothermal vents that hummed deep within the volcanic rock. The elite riders of the vanguard peeled away in perfect, silent discipline, taking their mounts toward the lower pens, leaving their ruler alone with his fragile cargo. Gideon did not hand her off to a servant. He did not call for a medical stretcher. He adjusted his grip with microscopic precision, holding her with a reverence that bordered on religious devotion, and began to walk. The interior of the citadel was a labyrinth of dark basalt, polished obsidian floors, and towering archways, deliberately designed to intimidate visiting warlords and rival alphas. But as he carried Cora deeper into the fortress, the oppressive military architecture began to soften. The harsh torchlight gave way to a softer, ambient glow radiating from enchanted crystal sconces. The ambient temperature steadily climbed, not with the aggressive boiling heat of his battle aura, but with a rich, encompassing warmth that seeped pleasantly into her numb extremities. He was bypassing the royal staterooms entirely. He was carrying her toward the highest, most secure elevation of the residential wing, a territory previously restricted to everyone but the king himself. The heavy oak doors at the end of a long, heavily guarded corridor stood open, flanked by two towering elite sentries, who immediately dropped their gaze to the floor in absolute submission as their master approached. The king stepped over the threshold, and the atmosphere shifted entirely. This was the sunlit conservatory. It was a breathtaking architectural marvel, suspended near the peak of the volcanic mountain, a sprawling sanctuary of life and light, completely isolated from the dead, frozen world outside. The ceiling and outward-facing walls were constructed from massive panes of reinforced glass that trapped every fraction of solar radiation, converting the weak winter daylight into a brilliant golden glow. The air here was incredibly humid and fragrant, thick with the scent of blooming winter roses, damp earth, and ancient ferns that grew in intricately carved stone planters. In the absolute center of this vibrant indoor Eden sat a massive bed carved from dark ironwood, draped in layers of the softest, thickest furs and heated woven blankets. It was not just a piece of furniture. It was a strategically placed nest, bathed in the warmest quadrant of the room, entirely shielded from the cold drafts of the stone fortress. The towering Alpha approached the bed, his glowing amber eyes scanning the linens for any imperfection. Slowly, agonizingly carefully, he lowered his arms. The sensation of being set down terrified Cora for a fraction of a second. Her body instinctively tensed, her storm-glass grey eyes widening as she anticipated the agonizing shift of gravity against her broken chest. But the pain never materialized. Gideon's massive hands supported her weight until her back made full contact with the incredibly soft, yielding surface of the mattress. The furs contoured perfectly around her fragile frame, providing equal gentle pressure that immobilized her torso better than any wooden splint ever could. He drew back slightly, his broad shoulders rising and falling with heavy, controlled breaths. The exhaustion of his devastating magical output was finally beginning to show in the tight lines around his mouth, but he did not sit down. He remained standing directly over her, a massive, unmovable barrier between her and the heavy oak doors. For the first time since the sickening snap of her rib in that dark, freezing pantry, Cora let her spine truly relax. The crushing, hyper-vigilant terror that had kept her muscles locked in a desperate bid for survival finally began to melt away. The ambient heat of the conservatory soaked into her bruised, battered skin. It was an overwhelming sensory relief, so profound that a single, rogue tear finally escaped the corner of her eye, slipping down her pale cheek and sinking into the dark fur beneath her head. Gideon's hand moved instantly. His large, calloused thumb brushed the moisture away with feather-light delicacy. "You are safe," the king rumbled, his voice a low, vibrating hum that resonated perfectly with the steady thumping of her heart. "There is no cold here. There is no cruelty here. The man who hurt you will never draw a painless breath for the rest of his miserable existence. That is not a promise. It is a finalized decree." Before she could find the breath to answer, the heavy wooden doors of the conservatory opened with a soft, distinct click. The woman who stepped into the sanctuary did not wear armor, nor did she cower under the suffocating, protective pressure radiating from the Alpha King. Maeve Frost, the chief royal physician of the Obsidian Peaks, moved with the calm, analytical grace of a woman who had spent decades pulling elite warriors back from the brink of death. She was a tall, striking figure with hair, the color of polished steel, pulled back into a severe braid. She carried a heavy leather satchel, and the air around her immediately filled with the clean, sharp scent of dried mint, crushed eucalyptus, and potent healing magic. The doctor stopped a respectful 10 paces from the bed, keeping her hands visible and her posture entirely non-threatening. She understood the biological volatility of the situation. The monarch had just found his fated mate, only to discover her severely abused and broken. His inner beast was pacing just beneath the surface of his skin, dangerously close to perceiving any sudden movement as a lethal threat to his newly claimed territory. "My king," the physician spoke, her tone perfectly even, completely devoid of the terrified reverence that characterized the rest of the fortress staff. "Devon Cross informed me of the injuries upon your arrival. I have prepared the osteobinders and the localized anesthetics, but I need to examine her." Gideon's massive frame immediately went rigid. A low, terrifying growl began to vibrate deep within his chest, a purely instinctual, feral refusal to let another living soul touch the fragile, broken woman in his bed. His golden eyes flared, locking onto the doctor with predatory intensity. The ambient temperature in the conservatory spiked dangerously, the blooming winter roses trembling under the sudden shift in atmospheric pressure. "Gideon." The name was spoken softly, barely more than a whisper, but it cut through his rising aggression like a blade through silk. The king snapped his attention back down to the mattress. Cora's small, raw fingers had reached out, hooking weakly onto the edge of his dark leather tunic. Her piercing silver-ash eyes, heavy with exhaustion but clear with absolute trust, looked up into his feral gaze. She was giving her quiet consent. She understood that the pain in her chest needed professional mending, beyond the ambient soothing of their soul bond. The terrifying warlord closed his eyes, fighting a massive, visible internal battle. The muscles in his jaw ticked as he forcefully reeled in his unhinged protective instincts. When he opened his eyes again, the lethal gold had dimmed to a deeply concerned, aching amber. "Do it quickly, Maeve," he ordered, his voice thick with strained control. He did not step away from the bed. Instead, he moved to the headboard, carefully sliding his arms under her pillow and sitting on the edge of the mattress, so that he was physically shielding her upper body. "If you cause her unnecessary pain, I will throw you off the highest parapet." "Understood, my lord," the doctor replied smoothly, unfazed by the royal threat. Maeve approached the side of the bed, opening her heavy satchel. She withdrew a series of small dark glass vials, a roll of pristine white linen, and a ceramic mortar filled with a thick glowing green paste. The scent of eucalyptus and ancient earth intensified, cutting through the heavy humidity of the room. "I need to expose the injury, my lady," the physician murmured to her patient, her hands glowing faintly with the cool blue light of diagnostic magic. With extreme care, Maeve used a pair of silver shears to cut away the ruined, blood-stained fabric of the linen dress that still clung to Cora's left side. As the freezing, wet fabric peeled back, the full extent of the trauma was finally exposed to the warm light of the conservatory. The skin over her third rib was a horrifying canvas of deep purple, angry black, and swollen crimson. The distinct, brutal imprint of Keith Thorne's reinforced leather boot was clearly visible, a violent brand of cruelty against her pale flesh. The area was severely inflamed, and a slight, unnatural depression marked the exact point where the bone had splintered inward. A sharp, ragged intake of breath hissed through Gideon's teeth. The sound was devastating. The Dark Monarch stared at the bruised flesh, his massive hands trembling where they rested near her shoulders. The phantom pain he had felt on the balcony was nothing compared to the visual confirmation of her suffering. His aura flared again, thick with that deep woodland aroma, vibrating with a renewed, sickening wave of retrospective hatred for the stepbrother he had left broken in the southern courtyard. "The fracture is severe, but it has not punctured the pleural cavity," Maeve assessed clinically, her glowing fingers hovering an inch above the bruised skin, mapping the internal damage through her magical resonance. "The bone fragments need to be drawn back into alignment before I apply the binder. This process is highly unpleasant." Gideon did not hesitate. He shifted his position, leaning his massive torso over her. He carefully cradled the sides of Cora's face with his large, warm palms, his thumbs resting gently against her cheekbones. He pressed his forehead directly against hers. "Look at me," the king commanded softly. She locked her gaze onto his luminous amber eyes. The moment their skin made full contact, the Dark Monarch unleashed a highly concentrated, deliberate wave of his alpha magic. He was actively scent-marking her soul, flooding their golden thread with an overwhelming, narcotic wave of pure, distilled comfort. The heavy, grounding aroma of ozone and sun-baked pine needles completely saturated her senses, acting as a profound, magical anesthetic. It was an ancient, primal mechanism of the mate bond, designed to shield a partner from catastrophic physical trauma. The physical world around her began to blur. The sharp edges of her exhaustion smoothed out, replaced by a floating, euphoric sensation of absolute security. "I am going to begin," Maeve announced quietly. The physician coated her hands in the glowing green paste. She pressed her palms directly against the swollen, discolored flesh of the broken rib. A sudden, sharp spike of pressure registered in Cora's chest, but before the agony could fully articulate itself in her brain, Gideon's magic surged. He inhaled sharply, a low, ragged sound catching deep in his throat. The massive muscles of his arms and chest seized violently, locking tight as the physical reality of their golden thread transferred the brunt of the bone realignment directly into his own massive frame. Sweat beaded at his temples. The king's jaw locked so hard it threatened to crack his own teeth, absorbing the torment so she wouldn't have to. He held her gaze, his thumbs slowly stroking her cheekbones, anchoring her entirely to the safe, burning heat of his presence, shielding her completely from the trauma. She felt a bizarre, deep-pulling sensation beneath her skin, as the magical paste reacted with the physician's aura. The splintered edges of the third rib were magnetically drawn back together, sliding into perfect anatomical alignment with a dull, distant click. The moment the bone was set, Maeve moved with blinding speed. She wrapped the area with thick layers of the pristine white linen, binding the ribcage tightly to ensure the bone could not shift again. The herbal poultice immediately began to seep into the skin, generating a deep, icy hot sensation that rapidly neutralized the lingering inflammation. "The alignment is stable," the doctor reported, stepping back and wiping her hands on a towel. She looked incredibly drained, the magical exertion having taken a toll on her own reserves. She must remain entirely horizontal for at least 5 days. The herbal binder will accelerate the calcification, but the soft tissue trauma will take time to heal. She needs hydration, high-protein nourishment, and uninterrupted rest. Gideon nodded once, his forehead still resting against his mate's. Leave the supplies. Tell the kitchens to send up bone broth and warm water. Then clear this entire wing. No one is to step foot on this floor without my direct verbal authorization. If a servant makes a sound louder than a whisper, they will answer to my vanguard. By your command, my king. Maeve bowed deeply. She packed her satchel with quiet efficiency and slipped out of the heavy oak doors, the lock clicking solidly behind her. They were entirely alone. The silence that descended upon the sunlit conservatory was not the heavy, suffocating isolation of the subterranean pantry. It was a rich, peaceful quiet, filled only with the soft rustling of the winter roses and the steady, synchronized rhythm of their breathing. Gideon slowly pulled back, though he kept his hands gently framing her face. The feral tension had finally drained from his massive shoulders. He looked down at the thick white bandages wrapping her chest, his expression unreadable, a complex mixture of profound relief and lingering heavy guilt. You called out to someone else, he said quietly, the words lacking any accusation, carrying only the vulnerability of a titan, exposing his deepest fear, the parchment of desperation, the blood. You wrote a name that was not mine. Cora blinked, her mind sluggish from the heavy dose of healing magic and the sheer exhaustion of her survival. She remembered the desperate, trembling strokes of the rusted nail in the dark, the exiled guardian in the south. I didn't know you existed, she whispered, her voice incredibly raspy from dehydration, yet carrying the absolute, ringing truth of the soul bond. I only knew the cruelty of my pack and the ghost of Alistair Vance. I threw a bloody prayer into a blizzard on a scrap of vellum, hoping for a stranger's mercy. Gideon's thumb brushed across her lower lip, his amber eyes searching the depths of her clouded silver irises. The wind knows who you belong to, the dark monarch murmured, the deep vibration of his voice sending a fresh wave of warmth down her spine. The storm bypassed the lowlands and brought your blood directly to my balcony. The moment I touched the parchment, my chest cracked open. I felt your bone snap. I felt the freezing stone against your skin. I knew with absolute terrifying certainty that if you stopped breathing, my own heart would simply cease to beat. He leaned down, pressing a slow, incredibly tender kiss to her forehead, lingering there as if trying to brand her with his devotion. You will never have to beg for sanctuary again, he swore against her skin, the promise sealing the atmosphere of the room with ancient, heavy magic. This citadel is yours. The Iron Vanguard is yours. I am yours. Every breath you take in this conservatory is a breath I will personally guard until the end of my days. The sheer magnitude of his declaration was overwhelming. The abused, invisible Omega, who had been locked in a freezing cellar just hours ago, was now the undisputed anchor of the most feared sovereign on the continent. She didn't need to fight anymore. She didn't need to keep her spine rigid to survive the mockery of a lesser alpha. She was allowed, finally, to be soft. Her heavy eyelids fluttered shut as the deep, narcotic comfort of the nesting room finally pulled her under. Stay right there, she mumbled into the darkness of her approaching sleep, unconsciously echoing the 4 words that had saved her life. I am never leaving, the Alpha King replied, pulling the thick shadow beast furs up to her chin and settling his massive frame into the chair beside the bed, beginning his eternal watch. 3 days passed in a blur of warm bone broth, the soothing scent of eucalyptus, and the constant, immovable presence of the Dark Monarch. Cora didn't know the Alpha King possessed a magic that could actively siphon pain. She didn't know his inner beast was currently clawing at the confines of his soul, demanding he return south to inflict 1,000 more fractures upon Keith Thorne. And she definitely didn't know that the simple act of breathing without agony was a luxury he would now personally guarantee with his kingdom's entire military might. When she finally woke fully, her mind clear, and the pain in her chest reduced to a dull, manageable ache, she found herself propped up against a mountain of velvet pillows. The sunlit conservatory was bathed in the brilliant, blinding light of a clear winter morning. The catastrophic blizzard had finally broken, leaving the surrounding volcanic peaks buried under pristine, glittering white snow. She turned her head. Gideon was sitting at a small ironwood table near the glass wall, silently reviewing a stack of military reports from Devon Cross. The Iron Vanguard had completely secured the southern borders. The bordering allied Alpha, who had demanded her as a bride, had formally surrendered his treaty and withdrawn his forces, terrified into absolute submission by the sheer demonstration of the northern warlord's wrath. The threat was entirely neutralized. He looked up the exact second her breathing pattern changed, his amber eyes instantly assessing her comfort level, ready to drop the affairs of an entire empire if she so much as grimaced. She smiled, a small, genuine expression that reached her eyes for the first time in 5 years. The king exhaled a long, steady breath, the tension leaving his massive frame as he offered a rare, devastatingly soft smile in return. She had stepped aside once, believing herself unworthy of a life without pain. She would never step aside again. The brutal snap of a rib in a freezing cellar had not been the end of her story. It had been the violent, necessary catalyst that brought the god of war to his knees before her. Thank you for listening to this story. If the journey from that dark, freezing pantry to the sunlit sanctuary of the Obsidian Peaks touched your heart, let me know in the comments below. Where are you listening from tonight? Let's meet in the comments. Did the Dark Monarch's swift and brutal retribution satisfy your need for justice? Your thoughts and presence in this sanctuary mean more than you know. And if you want to hear more stories of quiet strength, unbroken dignity, and ultimate absolute devotion, make sure to subscribe and join our pack. Until next time, stay safe, and remember, true worth can never be suppressed.